Imagine this: death row inmates, those who were supposed to face execution, but something strange happened, and they couldn't be executed. Many baffling legal and human dramas led to the improbable escape of some prisoners from the Grim Reaper's grasp. Today, we are going to look at these stories of the death row inmates who escaped their fate and survived their death date. Julius Jones. Julius Jones, a man who spent nearly 2 decades on death row in Oklahoma, saw his death sentence commuted by Governor Kevin Stitt. Jones had been convicted of the 1999 fatal shooting of Paul Howell, a businessman from an affluent Oklahoma City suburb. Throughout his time on death row, Jones consistently proclaimed his innocence, and his case gained widespread attention and support from celebrities like Kim Kardashian West and NFL quarterback Baker Mayfield. Jones's journey began in 1999 when, at the age of 19, he was a promising student athlete attending the University of Oklahoma on an academic scholarship. That year, Paul Howell was tragically shot during a carjacking in his parents' driveway. Jones was subsequently arrested and confessed to the crime, but his conviction raised numerous questions about the justice system. Over the years, doubts about Jones's guilt grew, with his attorneys presenting evidence of an alibi, suggesting he was with his family at the time of the murder. However, Howell's sister remained steadfast in her belief that Jones was the killer. The scheduled execution time for Julius Jones was 4 p.m. Central Time on the day of the commutation. Only Governor Stitt had the power to stop the execution, given Oklahoma's legal framework. Pressure mounted on Governor Stitt from various quarters, including celebrities, athletes, and lawmakers, to intervene and halt the execution. Kim Kardashian West, a vocal advocate for criminal justice reform, visited Jones in prison and used her platform to shed light on his case. Baker Mayfield, a prominent NFL quarterback, publicly expressed his belief in Jones's wrongful conviction. However, Paul Howell's survivors, including his sister Megan Toby, maintained their conviction that Jones was guilty. Toby testified that she vividly remembered seeing Jones shoot her brother, emphasizing that he had shown no remorse. In a rare act of clemency, Governor Kevin Stitt commuted Julius Jones' death sentence to life without parole just hours before his scheduled execution on November 18, 2021. While Jones's family expressed gratitude for the reprieve, they vowed to continue their fight for his release. Kim Kardashian and Jones's legal team also thanked Governor Stitt for the commutation, though they had hoped for a recommendation of life with the possibility of parole from the board. The family of Paul Howell found solace in the assurance that Jones would never be eligible for parole or further commutation. Attorney General John M. O'Connor expressed disappointment, believing the death penalty was warranted in Jones's case. John Babom Lee. John Lee, also known as Babom Lee, was a man who became famous for escaping execution in a murder case in England in the late 19th century. Born in Devon in 1864, Lee had a troubled past, including serving in the Royal Navy and a history of theft. In 1885, he was accused of murdering his employer, Emma Keyes, in her home near Torquay. The evidence against him was weak, mostly based on circumstantial factors like his presence in the house, his criminal record, and an unexplained cut on his arm. Despite maintaining his innocence, Lee was sentenced to death. The day of execution, February 23, 1885, became a fateful and bizarre event. 3 attempts were made to hang Lee, but each time the trapdoor on the scaffold failed to open. This unexpected failure led to the suspension of the execution. An investigation revealed a misalignment in the gallows, which caused the trapdoor hinges to bind. Due to this shocking turn of events, Lee's sentence was commuted to life imprisonment by the Home Secretary, Sir William Harcourt. Lee continued to proclaim his innocence and petitioned for his release, which he eventually obtained in 1907. After his release, Lee capitalized on his notoriety by touring and lecturing about his life story. He even became the subject of a silent film. However, his post-release life was marked by controversy and mystery. By 1911, he had abandoned his family and emigrated, with his whereabouts becoming increasingly unclear. In 1936, an article surfaced, presenting a new version of events, suggesting that Lee had protected a friend during the murder and had been wrongly convicted. This version, allegedly told by Lee himself, added another layer of intrigue to the case. Lee's true fate remained elusive for many years. While some speculated that he had died in the United States, Canada, or Australia, recent research suggests he passed away in Milwaukee, USA in 1945, under the name James Lee. His life after release from prison was far from the romanticized version he presented to the public. John Lee's escape from execution after 3 failed hanging attempts in 1885 made him a famous figure in English criminal history. However, the truth behind the murder case and his life post-release remains shrouded in mystery and controversy. Rodney Reid. Rodney Reid, born in 1967, faced a dire fate as an American death row inmate convicted in 1998 for the abduction, rape, and murder of Stacey Stites in Texas. His case stirred controversy and sparked a dramatic escape from execution. Stites, a 19-year-old from Giddings, Texas, was found dead in 1996. Reid initially denied knowing her, but when his DNA matched evidence from her body, he claimed a consensual affair. During the trial, the state cited other suspected crimes, pushing for the death penalty. Reid was sentenced to death in 1998 and sent to death row. However, doubt over his guilt led to a groundswell of support. In 2019, Reid's execution was scheduled for November 20th, but bipartisan lawmakers and celebrities championed a reprieve. Texas Governor Greg Abbott was urged to halt the execution, and the Texas Board of Pardons and Paroles unanimously recommended a 120-day reprieve. On the same day, the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals indefinitely stayed Reid's execution to examine his claims of innocence. Further delays followed in 2023 when the Supreme Court permitted Reid to seek DNA testing on the murder weapon. Rodney Reid's journey began in Texas, where he grew up with 6 brothers and excelled in sports. Stites' murder in 1996 raised suspicions about Reid's involvement due to similarities to another attack in which he was implicated. DNA evidence linked Reid to the crime, but he asserted a clandestine relationship with Stites. Reid's trial rested heavily on DNA evidence, with no other substantial proof or eyewitnesses. Reid's initial denials were attributed to fear and concerns about racial bias. The prosecution argued that Reid ambushed Stites on her way to work. In 1998, Reid was convicted and sentenced to death, with the prosecution highlighting previous rape charges against him. Appeals ensued, citing ignored witnesses and withheld evidence. The case gained immense attention, with celebrities and activists advocating for Reid's exoneration. The 2015 execution date was rescheduled to allow further evidence consideration. In 2019, public figures rallied behind Reid, leading to the reprieve and a renewed focus on potential new evidence. In 2023, the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals denied Reid a new trial, asserting his inability to demonstrate likely innocence. However, Reid's case reached the Supreme Court, which ruled in his favor on the statute of limitations, providing a glimmer of hope in his fight for justice. Kirk Bloodsworth. Kirk Bloodsworth's life took a harrowing turn when he became the first person in the United States to be sentenced to death and later exonerated. At just 22 years old, he found himself wrongfully convicted, serving 9 agonizing years behind bars before justice prevailed. In 1984, a tragic event shook Rosedale, Maryland. A 9-year-old girl was found lifeless, having endured a horrific ordeal of sexual assault, strangulation, and brutal beating with a rock. Bloodsworth's nightmare began with an anonymous tip and the testimony of a witness who identified him based on a police sketch shown on television. However, the description of the real perpetrator was significantly different from Bloodsworth's. The sketch portrayed a tall, blonde man with a mustache, while Bloodsworth was a red-haired man over 200 pounds. During his trial, 5 witnesses claimed to have seen Bloodsworth with the victim. Yet it emerged that 2 of them could not identify him during a lineup and had only seen him on TV after the crime. Additionally, a statement he made about a bloody rock and a mention of affecting his relationship with his wife was used against him, despite these claims being challenged later. Despite the absence of physical evidence linking him to the crime, Bloodsworth was convicted of rape and murder, landing him on death row. Bloodsworth's relentless fight for justice began with appeals questioning the rock incident and conversations about his wife. It came to light that the mention of the bloody rock stemmed from police showing him a rock during questioning. Furthermore, the incident with his wife simply involved failing to buy the requested groceries. The failure of the police to disclose information about another potential suspect eventually led to the appellate court overturning Bloodsworth's conviction 2 years after his initial sentencing. He was retried, and instead of facing the death penalty, he received 2 consecutive life sentences. In the early 1990s, Bloodsworth learned about the potential of DNA testing to prove innocence. After persistent efforts, DNA testing was finally conducted in 1992 on crucial pieces of evidence. The results were unequivocal. DNA analysis excluded Bloodsworth as the source. In June 1993, after nearly 9 years in prison, Kirk Bloodsworth tasted freedom. His long, arduous journey culminated in a full exoneration in December 1993. 2 years of his life were spent under the shadow of an impending execution. Bloodsworth's story didn't end with his exoneration. It fueled his determination to advocate for those wrongly convicted. He became a passionate speaker, sharing his own experience and advocating for justice reform. His book, Bloodsworth, published in 2004, shed light on his wrongful conviction. In his role as the advocacy director for Witness to Innocence, Bloodsworth played a pivotal role in the abolition of the death penalty in Maryland. Additionally, his advocacy led to the establishment of the Kirk Bloodsworth Post-Conviction DNA Testing Program, providing funding for post-conviction DNA testing. Ray Cron. Ray Cron's life took a nightmarish turn when he became the 100th person in the United States to be exonerated from death row after enduring a wrongful conviction. Born and raised in Dover Township, Pennsylvania, Cron's life was upended, and he faced an unjust ordeal that would span over a decade. In 1991, a tragic incident unfolded in Phoenix, Arizona, as a 35-year-old bartender named Kim Ancona was found brutally murdered in a bar restroom, a scene marred by violence and sexual assault. The ensuing investigation was fraught with challenges as the perpetrator left little physical evidence behind. Blood at the scene matched the victim's blood type, and traces of saliva on her body indicated a common blood type. Crucially, no DNA tests were conducted at the time. The case took a drastic turn when investigators focused on bite marks found on the victim's body. An acquaintance mentioned that Ray Cron, a regular customer at the bar, was present the night before. This led to Cron being asked to provide a styrofoam impression of his teeth for comparison. In the days that followed, Cron found himself arrested and charged with murder, kidnapping, and sexual assault. Throughout his 1992 trial, Cron steadfastly maintained his innocence, claiming he was asleep in his bed when the crime occurred. However, prosecution experts asserted that the bite marks on the victim matched the impression Cron had made on the styrofoam, leading to his conviction on murder and kidnapping charges. He was sentenced to death, with an additional 21 years for kidnapping. Notably, he was found not guilty of the sexual assault charge. Cron's fight for justice led to a new trial on appeal in 1996, yet he faced another conviction, largely based on the state's bite mark testimony. This time, though, the judge sentenced him to life in prison due to doubts about his guilt. The turning point arrived in 2002, more than a decade into Cron's imprisonment, when DNA testing finally unveiled the truth. Analysis of the saliva and blood found on the victim's body definitively excluded Cron as the source and identified the actual perpetrator, a man named Kenneth Phillips, who had never been considered a suspect in the murder. On April 8, 2002, Cron was released from prison, and by April 24th, all charges against him were formally dismissed. Subsequently, murder and sexual assault charges were filed against Phillips. Anthony Ray Hinton was wrongfully convicted of the 1985 murders of two fast food restaurant managers in Birmingham, Alabama. Despite being innocent, Hinton endured a 28-year ordeal on death row before finally regaining his freedom in 2015, following a unanimous decision by the Supreme Court of the United States to overturn his conviction. Hinton's ordeal began with the tragic murders of John Davidson and Thomas Wayne Vason, fast food managers who fell victim to armed robberies in early 1985. A survivor of a separate robbery identified Hinton, then 29 years old, from a photo lineup, setting in motion a chain of events that would change his life forever. At the time, Hinton worked at a supermarket warehouse and resided with his mother in rural Alabama. His arrest was accompanied by Detective Doug Acker's chilling words: "I don't care whether you did or didn't do it. If you didn't do it, one of your brothers did, and you're going to take the rap." These words foreshadowed the racial bias and injustice that Hinton would face throughout his legal battle. His public defense attorney provided inadequate counsel, showing little belief in Hinton's innocence. The trial was marked by a lack of credible evidence, with the prosecution's sole argument relying on ballistics tests that supposedly matched bullets from the crime scenes to Hinton's mother's gun, discovered during the investigation. No fingerprints or eyewitnesses were presented, yet Hinton was convicted of both murders and sentenced to death. Appeals in Hinton's case were initially handled by his public defender, Sheldon C. Perhatch, who faced repeated failures. Despite hiring a civil engineer with vision impairments and minimal forensic experience, the jury dismissed his testimony. Hinton's boss corroborated his alibi, confirming he was at work during the alleged crimes, but this crucial testimony fell on deaf ears. After a decade on death row, Brian Stevenson of the Equal Justice Initiative took up Hinton's case, fighting for justice for 16 years. Despite introducing evidence from forensic experts showing the bullets didn't match Hinton's mother's gun, the Alabama State Court initially refused to overturn his convictions. Finally, in February 2014, the U.S. Supreme Court unanimously vacated Hinton's state court conviction, citing constitutionally deficient, ineffective counsel. This decision marked a pivotal moment in Hinton's quest for justice. By April 2015, after nearly 3 decades of imprisonment, the state dropped all charges, leading to Hinton's release. Hinton's story is one of resilience in the fight against injustice. Since regaining his freedom, he has passionately advocated against the death penalty, authored a memoir titled The Sun Does Shine: How I Found Life and Freedom on Death Row, and shared his experiences widely. Melissa Lucho, born in 1969, faced a grim fate in Texas. She was accused of murdering her 2-year-old daughter, Mariah, and became the first Hispanic woman in the state to receive a death sentence. Mariah's death was marred by controversy. Prosecutors alleged abuse as the cause, while Lucho's defense argued it was an accidental fall down the stairs. Lucho's tumultuous life began with a difficult childhood marked by sexual abuse by her mother's boyfriend. She married at 16, had 12 children across 2 marriages, and endured substance abuse and domestic violence. Child Protective Services had previously intervened, but her children were eventually returned to her care. The tragedy unfolded on February 17, 2007, when Mariah was found unresponsive at home. Signs of abuse were present, including marks on her body, a fractured arm, and more. Lucho maintained that Mariah's injuries stemmed from the fall down the stairs 2 days before her death. However, authorities believed otherwise, and Lucho was subjected to a grueling 7-hour interrogation, eventually saying, "I guess I did it." During her trial, recorded statements from this interrogation were presented as a confession, and a pathologist testified that Mariah's injuries were consistent with abuse. In 2008, Lucho was convicted of capital murder and sentenced to death. Despite her defense's arguments and CPS records showing no prior abuse allegations, she remained imprisoned on death row. Over the years, evidence surfaced that raised doubts about her conviction. A 3-judge panel initially overturned her sentence, citing interference in her defense. Still, this decision was later reversed in an en banc hearing. A forensic pathologist questioned the previous medical examiner's conclusions, and a juror admitted changing his vote to the death penalty due to peer pressure. With her execution scheduled for April 27, 2022, clemency petitions were filed, and support from lawmakers and advocacy groups surged. Many argued that Melissa Lucho's case bore the hallmarks of a wrongful conviction based on a false confession. Survivors of trauma and abuse like her can be vulnerable to coercive interrogations. In a surprising turn, the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals granted a stay of execution on April 25, 2022, ordering a review of new evidence suggesting her innocence. While her future remains uncertain, her story has ignited discussions about the flaws in the criminal justice system and the need for reform. Dwayne Buck. Dwayne Edward Buck, an African-American man, narrowly escaped a death sentence after being convicted of fatally shooting his ex-girlfriend, Deborah Gardner, and her friend Kenneth Butler, while also injuring his sister. During his trial, psychologist Walter Quijano, brought in as a defense witness, made a damaging statement. Quijano suggested that black individuals were statistically more prone to commit violent acts. This assertion played a pivotal role in Buck's appeal, alleging racial bias in his sentencing. In 2000, Texas Attorney General John Cornyn recommended a review of 6 cases, including Buck's, due to racially biased testimony. However, Buck's case was not among those revisited. The other 5 cases underwent review but resulted in the reaffirmation of death sentences, as the questionable testimony was considered a minor factor. Buck's execution was scheduled for September 15, 2011, but the U.S. Supreme Court granted a stay of the process. While the justices acknowledged that Quijano's testimony could have led to a sentence reversal if presented by the prosecution, it was, in fact, used by Buck's own attorney during the trial. This legal twist sparked debate among the justices, with some suggesting a different outcome if the prosecution had introduced the testimony. In August 2015, the United States Court of Appeals for the Fifth Circuit declined to address the issue of race as a deciding factor in executions, citing Buck's failure to demonstrate extraordinary circumstances. However, the U.S. Supreme Court agreed to hear the case in October 2016, focusing on whether the Fifth Circuit had imposed an overly restrictive certificate of appealability standard. In a surprising turn, on October 3, 2017, Buck was sentenced to life in prison after entering a plea deal in a Harris County courtroom. District Attorney Kim Ogg, recognizing the tainted history of the case, decided not to pursue the death penalty. She stated that, given the case's racial implications, it was unlikely that a Harris County jury would hand down another death sentence. Instead, Buck pled guilty to 2 new counts of attempted murder, carrying concurrent 60-year terms to ensure he remains incarcerated. He will be eligible for parole in 2035. This plea deal marked the end of a 2-decade legal battle for Buck, who had faced numerous appeals and denials. The U.S. Supreme Court's earlier ruling highlighted the unconstitutional use of racial stereotypes during his sentencing, emphasizing that the law should focus on actions, not the identity of the accused. The case, with its racially charged undertones, will forever be remembered as a critical moment in the pursuit of justice. Peris Payne. In 1991, the U.S. Supreme Court tackled a crucial case known as Payne v. Tennessee guilty. This case ruled that victim impact statements, which describe the emotional and personal effects of a crime, can be presented during the sentencing phase of a trial, even in death penalty cases. The case revolved around Peris Payne, who faced prosecution in Tennessee for a horrific crime. According to his conviction, on June 27, 1987, Payne allegedly attempted to rape Yarus Christopher, an acquaintance, and then brutally murdered her and her 2-year-old daughter, Lacey Jo. The police found him covered in blood while leaving the scene. Payne's defense painted a different picture. He claimed he was visiting his girlfriend in the same building and rushed to help. Upon hearing screams from the victim's room, witnesses also reported seeing another man fleeing the crime scene. Nevertheless, Payne was convicted of 2 counts of first-degree murder and related charges. During the sentencing phase, both the defense and prosecution presented evidence. Payne appealed to the U.S. Supreme Court, which decided to reconsider its previous stance. On June 27, 1991, they ruled in favor of admitting victim impact statements, with Chief Justice Rehnquist providing various reasons. The court can consider all relevant evidence. The heinous nature of the crime justifies presenting such statements. Legal precedents can change over time. The defendant has the right to present mitigating evidence, so the prosecution should be able to present aggravating evidence about the victim. Justices Stevens and Marshall dissented, asserting that the victim isn't on trial and has no constitutional rights in the proceeding. The impact of the Payne case extends beyond the courtroom. It significantly influenced victims' rights, criminology, and the interpretation of stare decisis, the principle of legal precedent. It allowed victim impact statements in many U.S. courts, becoming a pivotal development in the victims' rights movement. Payne's case took numerous legal turns over the years. He maintained his innocence, garnering support from organizations like the Innocence Project and the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. In 2020, DNA testing was ordered to investigate his claims. On November 18, 2021, the Shelby County District Attorney General announced that Payne would serve 2 consecutive life sentences instead of facing execution. This decision was influenced by a law passed in 2021 that allowed death row inmates to appeal their sentences on intellectual disability grounds. Payne, found to have an intellectual disability, was no longer eligible for execution. He was resentenced to concurrent life sentences with a possibility of parole by 2027. Scott Lee Peterson. Lacey Peterson met a tragic fate in late 2002 when she was 8 months pregnant with her first child. Her husband, Scott Peterson, faced accusations and legal proceedings for her murder and that of their unborn son. While initially sentenced to death, Scott's path took a turn in 2020, leading to a life imprisonment sentence without parole in 2021. Lacey grew up in Escalon, California, working on her family's dairy farm. She attended college, majoring in ornamental horticulture. Scott, on the other hand, came from San Diego, California, and showed early promise in golf. He enrolled at Arizona State University on a golf scholarship, but eventually graduated from California Polytechnic State University with a degree in agricultural business. The tragic events began on December 23, 2002, when Lacey and Scott went about their day seemingly ordinary. Scott claimed to have gone fishing at the Berkeley Marina that day while Lacey was preparing for Christmas Eve. However, Lacey's sudden disappearance raised suspicion. The investigation initially focused on finding Lacey. Still, as the days passed, revelations about Scott's extramarital affairs emerged. Amber Frey, one of Scott's paramours, cooperated with the police, revealing their relationship. Suspicion grew as Scott's behavior seemed unusual, with inconsistencies in his statements about the day Lacey vanished. The search for Lacey involved extensive efforts, including volunteers, canines, and media attention. Sadly, on April 13, 2003, a baby's body washed up in the San Francisco Bay, followed by Lacey's remains a day later. Autopsies revealed grim details, but the exact cause of Lacey's death remained undetermined. During the trial, circumstantial evidence in Scott's demeanor played a significant role. The prosecution argued that Scott's motive included the affair with Amber Frey, financial issues, and a desire to escape the responsibilities of impending fatherhood. Scott's defense countered that there was a lack of direct evidence. Ultimately, in 2004, Scott Peterson was convicted of first-degree murder for Lacey and second-degree murder for their unborn child. He received a death sentence. However, his path took a different direction in 2020 when the California Supreme Court upheld his conviction but overturned his death sentence due to issues with the jury selection process. In September 2021, Scott was resentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Kenneth Thomas Richie, born in the Netherlands to a Scottish mother and an American father, found himself in a dire situation in 1986. A fire broke out in the apartment complex where he lived in Ohio, resulting in the tragic death of a 2-year-old girl named Cynthia. Richie was accused of starting the fire with the alleged intent of harming his ex-girlfriend. Richie's trial was marred by several issues. He faced a panel of judges instead of a jury, and his court-appointed defense lawyer had limited experience in murder murder cases. The prosecution argued that Richie had broken into a greenhouse to steal flammable materials, climbed onto a shed, gained access to the victim's apartment balcony, and set the fire. Witnesses provided conflicting testimonies, and the forensic evidence was questionable. Despite these concerns, Richie was convicted of murder by arson in 1987 and sentenced to death. He spent a staggering 21 years on death row. In 2007, Richie accepted a plea bargain to secure his release. He pleaded no contest to manslaughter, child endangering, and breaking and entering. This plea allowed him to maintain his innocence while securing his freedom. It's important to note that a no contest plea neither admits nor disputes guilt. During his lengthy incarceration, doubts about the evidence against Richie began to surface, especially concerning the forensic evidence. Amnesty International even described his case as one of the most compelling examples of potential innocence. Richie's journey took another dark turn in 2010 when he was arrested for making threatening phone calls to a former prosecutor. Despite his claims that it was a drunken prank, he was found guilty and sentenced to 3 years in prison. He was released after serving 2 years and briefly worked with a charity assisting homeless veterans. In 2020, Richie faced further legal troubles when he posted a threatening video targeting a judge and his family. He was convicted of making threats and received a 12-year prison sentence. Nicholas James Yarus, an American writer, endured a harrowing ordeal that saw him spend 22 years on death row in Pennsylvania for a crime he did not commit. Yarus had a troubled past, marked by childhood abuse and a descent into addiction and petty crimes. In 1981, he was involved in a car theft incident that led to his encounter with the police. During this encounter, a scuffle ensued, and a police officer's gun accidentally discharged. Yarus was initially charged with the kidnapping and attempted murder of the officer, but was later acquitted. While in jail, Yarus learned of the brutal murder and rape of Linda Mae Craig in December 1981, a crime that had remained unsolved. Hoping to gain favor with the authorities and mitigate the consequences of his pending charges, Yarus falsely claimed to have information about the murder. His attempt to help backfired when the person he implicated turned out to be uninvolved, making Yarus the prime suspect. Yarus was subsequently charged with the abduction, rape, and murder of Linda Mae Craig. In 1982, he was convicted and sentenced to death at the age of 21. Despite a brief escape from custody and numerous appeals, Yarus remained on death row. During his time in prison, Yarus taught himself to read, married a volunteer visitor, and became the first death row inmate to seek DNA testing. In 2003, after a series of inconclusive tests, a breakthrough occurred. DNA testing on key pieces of evidence, including gloves found in the victim's car and sperm samples, excluded Yarus as the perpetrator. This pivotal evidence led to the vacation of his conviction in September 2003. Yarus continued to fight for justice upon his release, advocating for the submission of DNA samples to the FBI database to identify the real culprits behind Linda Mae Craig's murder. He later moved to the UK, worked with Reprieve, and started a family. Subsequent marriages and divorces led him back to the United States and then back to the UK. In his pursuit of justice, Yarus filed a federal lawsuit for malicious prosecution against the Delaware County District Attorney's Office, which eventually settled for $4 million in 2008. Nicholas Yarus authored a memoir about his time on death row titled 7 Days to Live, later reissued as The Fear of 13, and penned other books sharing his experiences. His story was also featured in documentaries and podcasts, shedding light on the flaws in the criminal justice system and the importance of DNA evidence in exonerations. Anthony Porter, a resident of Chicago, faced a life-altering injustice when he was wrongfully convicted of a 1982 double murder on the city's south side. This wrongful conviction led to his sentencing to death in 1983, and he spent a staggering 17 years on death row. Porter's case reached a point where he was just 50 hours away from facing execution despite his claims of innocence. The turning point in Porter's case came in 1999 when new evidence emerged thanks to the efforts of Northwestern University professors and students from the Medill School of Journalism who were part of their school's Innocence Project. Prior to this, all of Porter's appeals, including those to the U.S. Supreme Court, had been repeatedly rejected. The pivotal moment in Porter's exoneration was the identification and confession of another suspect, All-Story Simon, which triggered a highly contentious process. Simon, who had returned to Milwaukee after living in Chicago in the 1980s, was pinpointed as the true perpetrator of the murders in 1999 by the Medill Innocence Project. Simon confessed to the crimes on videotape, leading to his guilty plea and a 37-and-a-half-year prison sentence. However, Simon later recanted his confession, claiming that it had been coerced by a private investigator, Paul Ciolino, who posed as a city police officer while collaborating with the Innocence Project. This controversy caused significant turmoil, resulting in the suspension of David Protes, one of the professors involved in the Innocence Project, by Northwestern University in 2011. It was also revealed that 2 witnesses had recanted their statements. A year-long investigation by the Cook County State's Attorney's Office ultimately led to the vacating of Simon's charges in 2014, securing his release after serving 15 years in prison. Remarkably, the question of who committed the double murders remained unanswered. Anthony Porter's legal journey also had its twists and turns. He filed a civil suit against the city in 2003, seeking $24 million, but a jury trial in 2005 ruled in favor of the city, affirming the original police investigation and prosecution's stance. On the other side, All-Story Simon filed a federal civil rights suit against Northwestern University's Innocence Project in 2014, claiming deception and coercion in his false confession. He received an undisclosed settlement in November 2018. The exoneration of Anthony Porter and the subsequent revelations about the flaws in his case had a profound impact on Illinois' stance on the death penalty. In 2000, Governor George Ryan initiated a moratorium on executions in the state, and in 2011, the state legislature passed a law abolishing the death penalty, a decision signed into law by Governor Pat Quinn. Earl Washington Jr., a man with intellectual disabilities, found himself at the center of a grave miscarriage of justice in 1984. Wrongfully convicted of rape and murder, he faced the death penalty in Virginia. Washington's ordeal began when he was arrested in 1983 for an unrelated crime, a neighbor's house break-in during a drunken dispute. Police used this arrest as an opportunity to coerce him into confessing to the rape and murder of 19-year-old Rebecca Lynn Williams, a crime that had occurred in 1982 in Culpeper, Virginia. Despite Washington's limited mental capacity, he was compelled to give multiple confessions, including one where he inaccurately described crucial details of the crime. His low-quality defense counsel failed to highlight his intellectual disability as a mitigating factor during sentencing. As a result, he was convicted of capital murder and sentenced to death. However, the case took a dramatic turn in 1985 when fellow death row inmate Joseph Giarratano, along with volunteer advocate Marie Deans in a pro bono defense effort, uncovered Washington's mental disability and secured a stay of execution just 9 days before he was scheduled to be executed. In 1993, a glimmer of hope emerged when DNA testing on evidence from the crime scene raised doubts about Washington's guilt. Unfortunately, Virginia's strict post-conviction limitations on introducing new evidence prevented immediate exoneration. Nevertheless, Governor Douglas Wilder commuted his sentence to life imprisonment in 1994. It wasn't until 2000, with the advent of more precise DNA testing, that Washington was fully exonerated. This time, Governor James Gilmore granted him a pardon, and he was released from prison after having spent over 17 years incarcerated for a crime he did not commit. In the aftermath of his exoneration, Washington received settlements, including one in 2006 from the estate of Agent Curtis R. Wilmore, who had coerced his false confession, and another in 2007 from the state of Virginia. These settlements acknowledged the grave injustice he had endured. Since his release, Washington has been rebuilding his life. He married and works as a maintenance worker in Virginia Beach. His case prompted a change in Virginia law, allowing inmates claiming innocence to seek DNA testing at any time, easing one of the nation's strictest rules regarding new evidence. This was all about the death row inmates who couldn't be executed. Thank you for staying with us. If you enjoy our content, our newest videos are just a click away.